All right, this is A Nation Divided. It is the third passage on the EOG release test questions, and it is your first nonfiction text. So typically you're going to get at least one historical passage, and this one happens to deal with the Civil War. So I know that from pre-reading, I look at the title and immediately A Nation Divided, I know it's about a civil war. That's a phrase that's almost always used for the Civil War in the U.S. And then I scan down and I see the date, 1861. That confirms that it is the Civil War in America, carried between the North and South. So again, when I'm pre-reading, what I'm looking for is just some basic context for where this is taking place, when it's taking place, and what it might be about. Now I scan down and see the titles, Crossing the Border, the Confederate Postal System. So I know it has to do something with mail. And so I'm going to be looking at and I can ask myself the question, well, what happened to the mail when the United States split into two parts during the Civil War? Because you would assume that the northern states wouldn't want to pay for the mail of the southern states and vice versa. So instead of having one United States Postal Service, it must have split into two. So this article must be about the splitting of those two postal systems and what they had to do in order to keep mail going. Because imagine, again, you're living in the North and you have relatives in the South and you want to get mail across. There had to be a way to do that. So that's my pre-reading prediction for what it's going to be about. Hopefully you did the same thing when you pre-read and then you launched in and took some notes and annotated as you went. Let's take a look at the first couple questions. Question 16, what is the central idea of the text? A, how the Postal Service adapted to the Civil War. So I read that immediately and I think that sounds reasonable because it talks about all the changes that had to happen in order for mail to continue during the Civil War. B, how the Union control of the mail affected the Confederacy. Now I know the Confederacy had their own postal system. It didn't work quite as well as the Union one, but so I can immediately cross that one off. C, the role of the Postal Service during the Civil War. Now that one seems reasonable too. It's a little bit more general than the first answer. So let's go on to the next one. D, the importance of mail for Confederate soldiers. Now I know mail is important for soldiers. It was then, it is now. It's the way to connect to home. But the passage is about a lot more than that. So that leaves me with two answers. One that's a little more general and one that's more specific. So generally, you want to look at the two answers and say, which one fits the passage better? And the main difference is use of the word adapted. So how the Postal Service adapted to the Civil War, that seems to fit a little bit better because it's talking about all the different ways they had to change throughout the war in order to keep the mail going. So I'm going to go ahead and choose A as the best answer. Question 17. What is a summary of the section entitled Crossing the Border? Now, as we always do, we need to go back to that part of the passage and take a look at it closely. So let me pull that one in. Now we know it's looking for a summary. So if we look at the answer choices, the question is, which of these give details and which of these give an overall picture of this section? So A, it details how many ships are used as blockade runners during the Civil War. So that almost never will be a summary because a list, just a small detail like here's how many ships were used, unless it's a passage that's very, very boring about just the number of ships used and it gives you the names of them and the manifests and everything, that's almost never going to be the right answer. So let's go ahead and, let me go ahead and get that one crossed out. It explains why ship mail was so expensive during the Civil War. Now, it does talk a little bit about that later in the passage. It also gives some information about the inland rates plus 2 cents, which are paid to the ship's master, about that. So that's a possibility. It describes how mail was transported from the North to the South during most of the Civil War. Now, the section is titled Crossing the Border. So I know that that one is probably a good answer because it's tying back to the title. And as we always do, we want to tie things back to the title when looking for central idea or even summaries. And then it defines the role of the ship's master as the new postman at the Confederate Post Office Department. That's another detail, so we can get rid of that one as well. So that leaves us, why is ship mail so expensive, or how it was transported? Clearly the better answer is C, how it was transported from north to south during most of the Civil War. That is the best answer because the section title is Crossing the Border, and it gives lots of details about how mail had to go from north to south. Question 18, how does the section entitled The Confederate Postal System contribute to the understanding of the title? So the title of the whole piece is A Nation Divided. So how does this section, and I pulled it in right above the question there, how does that contribute to our understanding of why it's called A Nation Divided? So A, the section explains why the United States Postal Service could not produce stamps during the Civil War. Well, we know that they produced stamps, so that one immediately we can rule out because that is just incorrect. That's not a correct detail from the story. B, the section describes the characteristics of the first Postmaster General, John H. Reagan. Now, again, in a long section like this, there's probably more than that. That's a very specific detail, and the section does a lot more than that. It doesn't really talk about him as a person a whole lot either. But if you notice, that's one of the first details given in the passage. So that one's sort of a trick answer where they think, well, if the person hasn't read the passage, they might see that and think, oh, that's in the first paragraph. That must be what the section is about. And then C, the section describes why ships were needed in the U.S. Postal Service. Now, that is a detail that's important. Like, you have to have ships at this time. But it also is not telling us why this is titled, or why this ties back to the title, A Nation Divided. And so D, the section explains that the Confederate States started their own postal service. That is the best answer because it ties it back to the title, A Nation Divided. So why is it divided? Because they needed their own postal service. So D. All right, this next question, 19. Why was the printing of postal stamps delayed for the Confederate postal system? This is one that if you know anything about the Civil War, you can kind of logic it out even without the passage. A, the stamp designs had to be imported from England. The passage does say directly that they were printing stamps in the United States, so we can get rid of that. It does talk about the Confederacy importing supplies from England, or so importing stamps from England at the time, but that's not why. B, the typical stamp printers were all located in the North. Now, the passage says that directly. Let's look at the others. All of the reliable stamp printers were housed in the South. No, that would not cause a delay, because if they were in the South, then they would have access to them easily, and no one could decide a design for the stamp. That also was not a factor. So B is the best answer. B, the typical stamp printers were located in the North. Question 20. What does the phrase first-person depictions of battle mean in paragraph 12? Now, I know what this means without looking back at paragraph 12, but you always want to look back just in case. So let's pull paragraph 12 in. All right, so this comes at the end of that first paragraph. So it's talking about letters home, would talk about the loneliness and the horrors of conflict. They were a relief in the soldiers' day. Families were not the only ones eager for word from their loved ones. For the first time, newspaper publishers could rely on soldiers' letters for first-person depictions of battles. So in that paragraph, it's talking about soldiers writing letters, describing what they saw, and sending them back to both home and the news media. So let's look at the answer choices. A, direct participation in the battles themselves. So no, newspaper publishers were not traveling to the battle to participate for themselves. B, permission to send letters about the battles. It's also not talking about that. It's talking more directly about getting letters from soldiers. Battle seen through the eyes of the men fighting. That sounds right. And D, recorded sounds of the battle. Now, the first recorded sound was in the 1860s. So while that's a possible answer, it's also very improbable that soldiers would have that technology. So the answer would be C, battles seen through the eyes of the men fighting. And number 21, how does the author support the claim that the U.S. mail tried to assist the communications between soldiers and their loved ones? A, the soldiers had to send their letters through certain cities. Now, the question is asking how they assisted them. So that one doesn't seem very likely to me because that doesn't sound like something that is assisting them, right? If you had to send all of your mail through certain cities, think how much slower that would be. So let's get rid of that one. B, the soldiers needed to have special stamps for their letters. Now, that also doesn't seem to assist them unless those stamps had a lesser fee. But again, that sounds like more hassle. So I'm going to get rid of that one as well. C, the soldiers did not have to pay for stamps to send their letters. That sounds like something that would help. Or D, the soldiers sent their letters on specially designed ships. So on this one, that word assist is our big key word here. How did they help? There's only one answer there that actually would help the soldiers send communications home. All right, question 22 is one of those with lots of adjectives in the answer choices, and so you need to choose the one where all of them apply. And for most of them, there's at least one or two that do apply, but one that doesn't. So how did the Civil War influence the mail service? A, mail service was difficult and slow. Okay, so pause there. Was it difficult? Yes. Was it slow? Yes. But it persevered, meaning it kept going. That one sounds correct, but let's keep going. B, mail service was carefully controlled and never faltered. Now that seems directly opposite to what the passage is talking about. So I'm just going to get rid of that one right there. Mail service was inept. Mostly, yes, that's true. Expensive, yes, that's also true. And rarely successful. Now that's where this question, this answer choice falls apart because it wasn't rarely successful. And D, mail service was interrupted for the duration of the war. That means there was no mail for the entire war. That's absolutely not true. So A is the best answer. And last one in the section, which statement is supported by information in the text? So A, the Union Postal Service played an important role in ending the Civil War. Now, it talks about how it was important in general and how the Union Postal Service was so much better, and so it worked better than the Confederacy system, but it doesn't say that it ended the Civil War. B, the Confederacy ran a successful mail program with Union support. Now, that one's also not true. They had much more difficulty in keeping their mail running. And even with help from the Union getting letters passed back and forth, it didn't work that well. C, the Union Postal Service lacked resources to support the Confederacy. Now, they're hoping that you're confusing the two because the Union is against the Confederacy, and so they didn't want to support them. They just helped at times to make sure that people could pass their mail on. So that's D, the Union limited the Confederacy's ability to send mail, and that would be your correct answer. All right, fill out your corrections form, and I'll see you on the next passage.